Is it Dogma Dan or Data Dan? Who will show up in Dan McClellan's view of Jesus and homosexuality? That's the question that I'll be addressing in this video as regards Dan McClellan's response to remarks I made on Jesus and homosexuality. Hi, my name is Robert Gagnon. I'm a professor of Bible at Wesley Biblical Seminary in Ridgeland, Mississippi. I previously taught at Middlebury College, at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary for a quarter of a century, and at Houston Christian University. I have a BA from Dartmouth College, a master's in theological studies from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. I've been publishing for over a quarter of a century on the Bible and homosexual practice, in addition to other things, starting with a 500-page book and doubling that over the years since. Dan McClellan, an Old Testament scholar, doesn't have a position at an academic institution, but he does have a large social media following. He presents himself on his videos as some kind of expert on the issue of the Bible and homosexuality, even though he has published only a 24-page chapter on the subject in a recently published book, The Bible Says So. First, a little background information. This video on Jesus is the first part of a longer rejoinder that I'll be doing in critique of Dan McClellan's response to Robert Gagnon video. His video had critiqued a prior video of mine entitled Homosexual Practice and Abominations, a response to Dan McClellan. His remarks on Jesus are toward the end of his response, and they're criticizing my brief 2-minute discussion about Jesus made at the end of my video on homosexuality and abominations. I'll play the clips that McClellan took from my video, along with McClellan's response to those clips, and then intersperse his response with my rejoinder. We know of no figure in the ancient world who applied the moral logic of a male-female prerequisite for sexual relations more rigorously than did Jesus of Nazareth. According to Mark 10, verses 2 to 12, with a parallel in Matthew 19, verses 3 to 9, Jesus made God's intentional creation of two sexual counterparts, male and female, the very foundation for limiting the number of partners in a sexual union to two, monogamy.
So I've addressed these passages in other videos.
And I addressed your indefensible arguments about these passages in a 35-minute video entitled Dan McClellan's Take on Jesus and Homosexuality, which you have ignored. I can understand why. It dismantles your position.
These are really just rationalizing a more strict prohibition on divorce.
Yes, Jesus is developing a strict prohibition of divorce, and more importantly, of remarriage after divorce, or at least a narrowly defined invalid divorce. But on what grounds? What is the moral logic behind Jesus' argument against divorce and remarriage after divorce? Of what possible relevance to Jesus' argument is his citation of just the last third of Genesis 1:27, male and female, God created them?
These are not generalizable to any kind of all-encompassing sexual ethic.
You just made a dogmatic assertion that you neither have demonstrated nor can demonstrate. Jesus does indeed develop a generalizable, all-encompassing sexual ethic by starting with the foundation of it all in Genesis 1:27, God's intentional design of male and female, a complementary sexual binary, two sexual counterparts, as the basis and foundation for limiting the number of persons in a sexual union to two. Moreover, how else would a man who divorces his wife and remarries be, quote, committing adultery against her, as Jesus puts it, since the law of Moses entitles men to more than one wife? The two-ness of the sexes, and he cites, by the way, Genesis 1:27, 1/3 of it, male and female, he made them. I mean, what's the point of citing that? It's a very short little compass. What could be involved there? Male and female. I wonder how that relates to restricting the number of partners in a sexual union to two. What's two about male and female? He made them very ambiguous. And he also cites, of course, Genesis 2:24 for this reason, namely because God intentionally designed in creation two and only two primary sexes. This is not the product of the fall, sin's entrance into the world. It's part of God's intentional design. For this reason, Jesus is in effect saying, a man may become joined to his woman, and the two become one flesh. The two-ness, for Jesus, the two-ness of the sexes, the binary character or duality of the sexes, is the basis for limiting the number of partners in a sexual union to two.
Of course, neither Genesis 1:27 nor Genesis 2:24 is prescribing monogamy.
Did you see the head fake that McClellan just did there? He completely ignored what I just said about the moral logic of Jesus' citation of Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, like a robot repeating its script. He denies that Jesus could have found a monogamy principle embedded in the moral logic of these verses, even though, as I've been pointing out for decades, so there's no excuse for McClellan's ignorance on this point, this monogamy principle in these texts is clearly, one, the basis for Jesus' rejection of remarriage after divorce, and two, confirmed by a sectarian Jewish group, the Essenes, who over a century before Jesus found just such a monogamy principle. The Essenes cited the very same last third of Genesis 1:27 that would be cited later by Jesus. Male and female, he created them, with its delineation of God's intentional creation of only two complementary sexes, as the basis for rejecting polygyny, multiple wives, among the town Essenes who could marry. Incidentally, they called that one-third of Genesis 1:27, quote, the foundation of creation, unquote, no less. That's not an all-encompassing sexual ethic. They logically connected the two-ness of the sexes with a two-ness of number, that is, no more than two persons in a sexual union at any one time. They even linked the phrase, quote, male and female, saka unakeva in Hebrew, with its reuse in the Noah's Ark story, where the animals go into the ark two by two, male and female, as a way of underscoring the two-ness of the sexes as a basis for rejecting polygyny, unions involving more than two people. It's impossible for McClellan to deny reasonably, based on historical data rather than his LGBTQ dogma, that Jesus could have interpreted the last third of Genesis 1:27 in the same way that the Essenes did.
Since both of these texts, written by different groups in different time periods, were written by people for whom, and in time periods when, polygamy was normative. They're obviously not prescribing monogamy or proscribing polygamy, and they wouldn't problematize polygamy within Judaism until the Greco-Roman period under the influence of Greco-Roman social convention and Greek philosophical tradition.
5 points demonstrate that McClellan's argument is based far more on LGBTQ dogma than biblical data. First, whenever the original intent of the authors of Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, there can be no denying that Jesus did see a moral logic for monogamy within 1:27 and 2:24, given the Essene parallel. McClellan is arguing as an LGBTQ ideologue dependent on dogma, not as an historian relying on the data. The Essene citation of male and female, God created them, in Genesis 1:27, described as the foundation of creation and used to rule out polygyny, is by far the closest parallel to how Jesus is using the same last third of Genesis 1:27 to prohibit remarriage after divorce in Mark 10, verses 2-12, with a parallel in Matthew 19, 3-9. Even New Testament scholar William Loader, who has written the most on sexuality in early Judaism and Christianity, and who pushes for the church's embrace of homosexual unions has to admit this. Second, when assessing what the authors meant in Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, it's important to remember that writers can sometimes say more than they know, not grasping the full implications of what they write. Third, it's entirely possible that the authors of these texts intended an implicit or veiled criticism of multiple wives as incongruous with the moral logic of these texts. For example, the author of Genesis 2:24 is the same as the author who depicted bloodthirsty Lamech as the first polygamist in Genesis 4:19. He also narrates the problems of polygamy in Jacob's marriage to both Leah and Rachel in Genesis 30, and he was doubtless aware of the problems arising from kings multiplying many wives. Fourth, and most importantly, Jesus was right to view the moral logic of Genesis 1:27 and 2:24 as carrying the seeds of polygyny's destruction. Look at Genesis 1:27. Here we have God's intentional creation of two and only two sexes, self-contained sexual counterparts, divinely designed as a reproductive pair. Then we have Genesis 2:21-24, where we have the picture of Yahweh's creation of woman as an extraction from the original Adam or human, leaving a missing element, such that marriage is viewed not just as a union, but a reunion of an originally undivided whole. Fifth, Jesus' statement in Mark 10:11 that, quote, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, unquote, works only on the premise that Jesus, by a citation of Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, is overruling an allowance of polygamy for men given in the law of Moses. Otherwise, even though Jesus counts the divorced woman as still the man's wife after a writ of divorce is given her, a remarriage on the husband's part would just give him two wives on Jesus' logic, which he is permitted under Mosaic law. Only on the assumption that Jesus has revoked the option of men having multiple concurrent wives can the man be committing adultery against his wife when he remarries. If Jesus is rejecting the lesser offense of serial polygamy in the form of remarriage after divorce, of course he is also rejecting the greater offense of concurrent polygamy. This is Logic 101. It takes an intense dogmatist to deny it. Even scholars who have written on homosexual practice in the Bible, who push for the acceptance of homosexual unions in the church, William Loader and James Brownson, acknowledge that Jesus is implicitly prohibiting polygamy based on the creation text. Homosexual practice, of course, is a direct assault on that foundation for sexual ethics because it eviscerates a male-female prerequisite, which is the basis for arriving at a limitation of number to two persons in a sexual union. I don't know how McClellan can claim to be a faithful Christian, if he does, in any meaningful sense, when by his own standards he has to regard Christ as a right-wing authoritarian who is harming people. That's the person whom he should be calling Lord.
My Christianity is irrelevant to my scholarship.
Well, in one sense, that is true, since what you call my Christianity bears little resemblance to that faith as regards sexual ethics and many other areas. But in another sense, it's not true, since LGBTQ dogma has melded with whatever you call my Christianity, and it causes you here to disregard the historical data in favor of that dogma.
And this is another indication that you're not good at generating arguments intended for anyone other than people who already agree with you, because your arguments seem to come down to our identity politics.
How hilarious. How ironic. Nice fake, Dan. What you just did is a textbook case of projection. The one who is not exercising, quote, critical thinking, but, quote, rationalizing and defending his dogmatism and his identity politics, unquote, is clearly you, because you are the one disregarding the historical data in favor of your LGBTQ dogma. You're the one who is falsifying the historical record about Jesus' sexual ethics, ignoring why he cites, quote, male and female, he created them, and ignoring the parallel use of Genesis 1:27 by the Essenes to reject polygyny. My assessment of your position as heretical doesn't happen in an historical vacuum. It happens after assessing Jesus' words in their historical and literary context. It's not an either or, Dan, but it's a both and. The interpretation that I reach best fits the historical and literary data, while you have chosen an interpretation that least fits the data because of your LGBTQ dogmatic concerns. My historical argument about Jesus that you are dodging is precisely an argument intended for people who don't share my views on homosexual practice. Your charge that I am, quote, not good at generating arguments intended for anyone other than people who already agree with me is thus fallacious. On dogmatic grounds, you can't admit that Jesus held such a position on a male-female prerequisite and foundation for sexual ethics, because it would make it very difficult for you to achieve your dogmatic goal of showing that the opposition to homosexual practice in the Bible has no relevance for today. You can't admit what Jesus really believed, because it would mean that Jesus himself took an approach on sexual ethics that is diametrically opposed to the one that you are advocating for. That would pull the historical, theological, and moral rug right out from under your dogmatic feet. What I have shown here, and let's be clear about it, is that McClellan apparently felt compelled to distort and falsify the historical evidence about Jesus because his left-wing, LGBTQ, authoritarian identity politics demanded it. In the process, he projected everything he was doing onto me in a shameless attempt at throwing his own followers off the trail of the data. For a fuller defense of my argument about Jesus and Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, watch my 35-minute video entitled Dan McClellan's Take on Jesus and Homosexuality, exposed by Robert Gagnon as LGBT dogma over biblical data. Establishing Jesus' view of a male-female prerequisite as the very foundation of sexual ethics, the basis and ground from which other crucial sexual standards are extrapolated, like monogamy, is sufficient all by itself to dispense with McClellan's dogmatic claims about the biblical witness not condemning homosexual practice across the board. A male-female foundational requirement for acceptable sexual relationships transcends any considerations about commitment or orientation, just as it does for polyamorous and incestuous bonds. And by the way, contrary to McClellan's claims, Jews and Christians of the Greco-Roman milieu already knew about committed homosexual relationships between men and between women, and still rejected such unions as contrary to nature, because obviously a man is not a sexual counterpart to another man or a woman to another woman. Even with regard to sexual orientation, rudimentary theories of such were already circulating in the Greco-Roman world, and some Greco-Roman moralists and physicians embracing these views still rejected such unions as contrary to nature. McClellan needs to get over his puerile love affair with sexual orientations. There is, for example, a sexual orientation for polyamory. Some opposite-sex siblings raised in different households and reunited as adults feel a strong sexual attraction for each other. I doubt whether pedophiles would do what they do if they had a choice not to feel such impulses. An innate orientation to commit sinful actions objectionable to God does not turn an evil into a good. Sin is an innate orientation portrayed by the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul, in Romans 7 as an innate impulse running through the members of the human body, passed on by an ancestor and never entirely within human control. As Northwestern University psychologists Brian Mustansky and J. Michael Bailey once wrote, despite common assertions to the contrary, evidence for biological causation of homosexuality does not have clear moral, legal, or policy consequences. To assume that it does logically requires the belief that some behavior is non-biologically caused. We believe that this assumption is irrational because all behavioral differences will on some level be attributable to differences in brain structure or process. Thus, no clear conclusions about the morality of a behavior can be made from the mere fact of biological causation because all behavior is biologically caused. And any genes found to be involved in determining sexual orientation will likely only confer a predisposition rather than definitively cause homosexuality or heterosexuality. And these are two, as far as I know, non-Christian psychologists, secular psychologists, who have done an extraordinary number of studies about causation factors for homosexual development. They're thoroughly supportive of homosexual unions. Jesus was the most rigorous proponent of the moral logic behind God's intentional design of a sexual binary in all of history. By the way, the phenomenon of the so-called intersex doesn't actually undermine this moral logic behind a binary. First, because we are talking here about God's intentional design and creation. We're not talking about a situation that occurs due to a breakdown in the processes of nature owing to the presence of sin in the world. Think, for example, of conjoined twins whose existence is not a credible argument for imploding the value of monogamy. And second, it doesn't undermine the moral logic of the binary because there is no third sex. An organism's sex is defined by the type of gamete that it is designed to produce, sperm for males and ova for females. The equipment may malfunction or be deformed in some way, but the design is still evident. There is no third gamete type. Therefore, sex is binary and fixed. McClellan is compelled to say about Jesus, if he decides to accept the historical data while still retaining approval of homosexual relations, he has to say about Jesus that Jesus not only was completely wrong about God's will for the very foundation of human sexual ethics, but also he was diabolically opposed to God's true will, a tool of Satan and the world's biggest bigot against LGBTQ people. If Jesus had had any sense and moral compass, using McClellan's reasoning, he would not have espoused what is
hateful and harmful and stupid, and you should grow the hell up.
Which is what McClellan says to followers of Christ who uphold Jesus' position as good disciples. If you agree with McClellan on that, make him your Savior and Lord, though I don't think that will be very helpful to your salvation. Be sure to check out my 35-minute video, Dan McClellan's take on Jesus and homosexuality, exposed by Robert Gagnon as LGBT dogma over biblical data, and be on the lookout for my forthcoming video rejoinder to McClellan on the interpretation of the Levitical prohibitions of same-sex intercourse, where I will further explore McClellan's dogma over data approach. God bless you.